I think that when you come back to like, how can we fix this? I always ask myself, like, is America really trying to fix it? Yeah. Because there's all these like bright lights of how things have worked and succeeded, yeah. And we've never really came together and said, okay, we're going to eradicate this once and for all. But we've done that with other health crises, like we took HIV/AIDS head on, we took COVID-19 head on, we're taking the opioid crisis head on. And we've seen America rally around different health crises. But for this one, it seems like we don't want to fix it completely. We just want to get the mass shootings out the way, or we want to stop the school shootings because, that's terrible. But, we don't, inner city stuff, we don't know, maybe, right? And I wonder what it's going to take to get over that hump where we have this aggressive, all-of-government, nationwide approach to eradicating it.
Welcome, everybody. My name's Jennifer McKim. I'm the Deputy Investigative Editor at the GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting, which is based here at GBH News. I'm pleased to welcome you to this talk on what can stop violence in America. Gun violence is one of the most important issues that we journalists can cover in the United States. And I was just talking with some of these amazing panelists and discussing how we're not doing it so well. There's some remarkable work out there, of course. There's the Washington Post, which has been following fatalities by police since 2015. There's been more than 8,000 deaths since that time. A recent investigation by the Boston Globe focused on the lack of inspections in gun shops in Massachusetts, which has one of the strictest gun laws in the country. And there's continued insightful work from The Trace, which is the country's only nonprofit newsroom dedicated to covering gun violence. But more needs to be done. And tonight we have a chance to think of advancing these important topics through a different lens, from politics to policy, and how such policy is received by the public. So to talk more about tonight's event, I'm welcoming Susan Spurlock, Executive Director of the Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University, partner of the GBH Forum Foundation, who is hosting the event. Susan, thank you so much for being here, and I'll pass it to you.
Good evening. Thank you. So as Jen said, I'm Susan Spurlock, the Executive Director of Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University. The Forum is the nation's oldest continuously operating free public lecture series, which has been in operation since 1908. I'm delighted to welcome you, along with Jen, to this evening's program, From Politics to Policy, What Can Stop Gun Violence in America. This is the first in our winter program, part of an 8-part series that we kicked off last fall with 4 really interesting and timely sessions. In this evening's important and timely conversation, we will hear different approaches to stopping gun violence in America, offered by our nationally recognized guest speakers. This series is part of an ongoing collaboration among Ford Hall Forum, GBH Forum Network, the Washington Center, and the Political Science and Legal Studies Department at Suffolk University. I'd also like to recognize the Lowell Institute for their generous funding, which makes programs like this possible. Among our audience members this evening are students from 3 Suffolk University political science classes, the Politics of Public Policy, which is a graduate level class. Students are also here who participated in a forum, a seminar held at in Washington, D.C., hosted by the Washington Center. And finally, we have students from the Marginalized Groups and Public Policy class. And before I introduce our moderator and our special guests, I'd like to acknowledge our virtual audience. More than 300 people signed up to attend online tonight. Thank you for joining us. As you know, your cameras are off and your microphones are muted, but we do want to hear from you. So please put any questions that you have in the Q&A box, which is being monitored, and we'll be sure to get your questions to the evening's moderator. And for those in the here in person in our audience, please raise your hand. I see there is a microphone in the back, and we will need you to speak into the microphone for audio recording purposes. It's now my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers for this evening's program. David Hemenway is a professor at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and director of the Harvard University Injury Control Research Center and one of the nation's leading authorities on gun violence. Dr. Hemenway has written widely on the public health approach to reducing firearm violence. Greg Jackson is a gun violence survivor and executive director of Community Justice Action Fund, which addresses gun violence in a holistic, sustainable, and intersectional manner. CJAF utilizes evidence-based research, data, and analytics to drive the conversation around injustices, especially those that disproportionately affect communities of color. And finally, Kevin Drakulich, Associate Director and Associate Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the Northeastern School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. His work focuses on three interrelated lines of research on questions related to race, inequality, and crime. The social processes related to crime and its consequences across communities, perceptions of crime, disorder and social control within communities, and perceptions of race, crime, control, and related policies. This evening's moderator this is Christina Coolidge, who is a faculty member in our Political Science and Legal Studies Department at Suffolk University. It's now my pleasure to introduce Christina.
Thank you, Susan, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to GBH, to the Lowell Institute, to Suffolk University, to the Washington Center, to our audience, both live and virtually, and most especially to my panelists who have kindly said yes to be here. So since this actually is kind of a class for everyone, what I'd like to do is do my professor thing and set the stage. So we are not here to talk about gun control per se. We are here to talk about also not stopping gun violence, but reducing gun violence. That's the goal. The question is, how can we get there? We have very little research about which policies that we often hear bandied about actually do in terms of affecting outcomes, but we do know a little bit. So the Rand Corporation has a study that they've been doing since about 2016, and it has been updated, and they essentially look at 7 different outcomes that are associated with guns and gun violence. So defense, the gun industry, mass shootings, suicide, accidents, police shootings, and violent crime. And then look for studies that can actually provide some insight about whether or not we have any evidence, actual evidence, of what the impact of the use of those policies are. And they examine policies across 3 different venues. So one is policies that regulate who can legally own, possess, or purchase firearms. The next is the set of policies that are about regulating sales and the transfer of firearms. And the third area are policies that regulate the legal use, storage, and carrying of firearms. So 18 total policy areas out there. What they found, after looking at all of the available studies that met their criteria for excellence, essentially, was that only 3 of those 18 policy areas had what they called supportive evidence on outcomes. So one relates to child access, so storage of guns. And Rand says that there is substantive evidence that reducing the amount of access that children have to guns and having safer storage of firearms results in the reduction of injuries, suicides, homicides, assaults, injuries, accidental shootings, and death, especially among young people. The only other two policy areas where they found supportive evidence were stand your ground rules, which actually increased homicide, and conceal carry laws or conceal carry liberalization that also increased homicides. The rest either had only moderate, inconclusive evidence, or there weren't studies done at all. So where does that leave us? I mean, we focus on mass shootings. Suicides are actually the number one cause of, or the number one category of injury and, well, death by firearm. So if assault weapon bans are the thing we're focused on, I mean, I'm all for it. I don't think there should be military-grade weapons out there, but that's not going to do anything to reduce the largest cause of death by gun. So the question for all of you is, where does that leave us? How do we get past screaming, pro and con, and make some actual difference and reduction in the number of injuries and deaths, which I think we can all agree is way too high. So jump in, anyone who wants to start off.
So I can start. So there's so many things that can be done. There's things, one of the things that, let me talk first about the public health approach, because I think that's a useful way of thinking about all the things that can be done. And the public health approach is really trying to get everybody to agree there's a problem, and then everybody to do a little something, to get universities to do something, to get undertakers to do something, to get hairdressers to do something, to get foundations to do more, to get states to do more, and so forth. Then what you want to do is, if we're going to have lots of guns, to figure out all the different ways we can do something, right? And so the analogy which people seem to understand a little bit is that you don't need to just focus on the gun user. That there's, for any injury, there's about a dozen things that had to happen, and typically the most cost-effective way is not to wait till just before it happens, but to go upstream and change the product or the environment. One of the things we in the injury prevention field, and we've been doing this for 50 years, is talking about successes. And so one of the great successes we've had in the area has been in motor vehicles. And it used to be that 50 years ago we were told by the motor vehicle manufacturers, the same way we're told by the gun manufacturers today, that it's all the individual's fault. That if only drivers were better, if only people behaved better, things would get much better. And there's no question that in the car area, if everybody was perfect, a perfect driver, you never made mistakes, you never got angry, you always obeyed the law, you were never distracted, that there would be very few accidents, and if people really were law-abiding, there'd be almost no deaths, because most deaths are caused by...
Sounds like a wonderful world.
Right. But what happened there was that we had a lot of public health physicians who said, let's not just look at who, quote, caused the accident, but let's look at other things like what caused the injury. And people were being injured because they were killed by steering wheels, which went right through your people's chest. They were killed because people left the car and their heads would hit the cement or the hood of the car and their brains would get destroyed. People were being killed because they'd go off the road for 1 second and hit lampposts and traffic and lights, which were being right along the sides of runways. And public health physicians said, couldn't we make the cars safer? Couldn't we make the road safer? And the answer was, yes, we could. And you fast forward 50 years, and nobody thinks our drivers today are any better than they were 50 years ago. Nobody thinks our pedestrians are any better. Nobody thinks our bicyclists are any better. And they're not. But what happened is that it's been like a reduction of close to 90% reduction in fatalities per mile driven. And how did we do that? Because we made the cars safer, because we made the roads safer. There's so many things that can be done. We created a good data system, so we know what's wrong. We gave a lot of money to analysts to figure out when you analyze the data, to figure out what can be done, and then to see if what you're doing makes sense. We've changed a lot of social norms. There have been a lot of people, just like here, I see Moms Demand Action. There was, Moms Against Drunk Driving. We really changed so many things, and the notion became you don't need to change what's the hardest thing to change, which is people. There's lots of other things you can be done, and you can change social norms, you can change the product. There's so many ways to make guns safer, to make guns more easily change them so we can find criminals and detect who the criminals are. And so there's sort of an infinite number of things. And just as in motor vehicles, we had to worry about lots of different aspects of the motor vehicles. We had to worry about fires afterwards and so forth. In the area of guns, you have to worry about not only the mass shootings, but the suicides and the homicides. We've been doing lots of stuff about suicides, working with gunners to try to figure out ways to reduce gun suicide, I think somewhat successfully. But anyway, there's so many wonderful things that can be done. And I could list all the things that manufacturers could do, all the things that gun owners could do, all the things that gun retailers could do, and all the things that any groups could do if they decided this is something that can be done. I wrote this book years ago about success stories in injury and violence prevention. There's 64 easily found, documented successes about how the world's been made safer in all different kinds of areas. And the gun area can be one area, and we've had some real successes in the gun area, which I could talk about if you wanted to.
Yeah, well, one thing I just wanted to add, and maybe you can address this, Greg, is that none of these 18 policy areas actually reduce the overall number of guns. It's talking about the entry of new guns. And you seem very pessimistic. I thought you were the optimist.
What about?
About changing behavior and culture.
Oh no, I think you can do it. I think it's what you can't do is think, oh, we're going to make the big difference by arresting lots of people. Or we're going to make a big difference by trying to say, oh, if only people didn't attempt suicide, then we could solve the problem. That's what the issue is. But yes, you can change people by changing norms. It's hard to change sort of people one at a time.
Well, Greg, what do you think about that from the community perspective, where you are?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll push back a little bit. I mean, I do believe that we can change people one at a time and have a big impact. And where we're seeing it happen in places all over the country. I guess I'll just start with my personal story, though. You know, I was someone who was always passionate about politics and policy change and studied it in college and all of that, and got involved with campaigns and all that, all likes of that after college. But in April 2013, I was shot as an innocent bystander in Washington, D.C. And as traumatizing as it was for me physically and emotionally, what was probably more traumatizing was how I was treated after being shot. You know, when I entered the hospital, I was met with investigators, law enforcement, before I met my surgeon, before I met my doctor, and the bullet had hit 2 arteries, so I was bleeding to death. And I'm over here answering questions about my whereabouts and why I was here and what I do with the drugs and where's my gun, and I'm in and out of consciousness. And luckily I made it, but I was within 30 minutes of dying due to blood loss, and those were crucial seconds that were lost. And even after that, when there was news articles about me being shot, in the comments, all you see is, oh, well, another gangbanger off the street, and, you know, think, oh, well, he probably was out there selling drugs, you know, and it's like, wow, like, is that really what America sees, you know, when black men get shot? And from what I can tell, ever since that day, that is what we've seen, you know, that America looks at black and brown communities and looks at gun violence as a crime problem. And we're more focused on solving the crime first and then maybe saving a life or two versus even looking at what happened. And I do have a quick little slide. I just want to show you all just one highlight from here. If they can pull up the first slide. But, I'll go back one. There we go. So a lot of what we do at Community Justice is really tell the story about what's really happening around gun violence, because the misconception is that it's all mass shootings that are mental health related, and in black and brown communities it's crime issues. But a huge stat is that we found that 70% of homicides in the black community are not connected to another felony, and 89% of homicides in the black community are not connected to gang violence. And so you would think that on television and what you see in the 5 o'clock news that there's some war going on, some drug war or whatnot, but reality, most of the situations are interpersonal conflict that get out of hand. And a lot of it is petty things that would have been squashed or people would have let go or been friends again later. And it's really conflicts between people that are on the edge, but who happen to have a firearm. And that's literally why I was shot. What also is really scary, though, is because we're seeing those numbers, but we're also seeing these huge spikes in homicide. We saw a 39% increase in black homicides since the beginning of COVID, 172% increase in teen homicides. But this all happened in a time where other forms of crime decreased. And so we're now watching the data make this very clear point that if we're just focused on crime control, then we would have seen a very opposite trend, but we haven't. And so I think the American way or the American perspective to address this, especially in inner cities, of focusing on crime, not only is it failing, it's neglecting these real solutions that could slow down these surges and spikes that we're seeing all over the country. And so I will just quickly run through these 2 slides. I'm sorry, I don't want to lecture y'all. It's a classroom, yeah. It's after 6 though. I would never be in a lecture after 6 when I was in college, unless I was asked to be there, with some incentives like extra points. Anyway,
dinner. We'll take you to dinner.
Yeah. But from our perspective, from what we can see in a lot of the organizations we partner with, one of the biggest indicators of homicide and violence in black and brown communities is not criminal activity. It's have they been exposed to violent trauma. And so what are we doing to help those who have been traumatized navigate through that recovery or navigate back into a reality that did traumatize them? And one key thing that we've seen is that 40% of people who have been shot will shoot someone else, will be shot again, or will be killed. And so if we can just focus on those who have been directly impacted, we could see some drastic reductions. We also think, and this is all building on a public health approach, that there are real risk factors that make those situations where people who have been traumatized, having these conflicts, more likely to be deadly. And access to firearms is obviously number one, but it's not the only one. And then lastly, there are real root causes that have fueled this cycle of violence that increases these risk factors and ultimately makes these situations where people are traumatized, having an altercation, as explosive as they are. So the last slide I have for y'all, and you can go to our website and learn more, is there are definitely solutions, and this is back to the public health approach. There are so many different solutions that can focus on chipping away at the issue of violence, especially in our communities, whether that's violence intervention programs that do focus on behavior. So programs like Advanced Peace, ROCA here in Boston, that applies behavioral therapy strategies for those who already have a pattern of at-risk behavior, or hospital-based intervention that works with families after a shooting has happened and helps decrease the likelihood of retaliation, and even support and resources for victims and survivors is really helpful in reducing the likelihood of further harm. And so these are things that we could do right now that can disrupt that cycle of violence and those behaviors of violent activity. But what we're seeing across the country is that they're not really invested in. Prior to 2019, the federal government only invested around $16 million in these strategies versus the billions that we're putting into crime control strategies. And so that's been a big priority for us. It's like, how do we make sure that we not only look at the hardware reduction and preventing, the stream and flood of guns into these communities, but how do we take advantage of programs that we know work? We've seen evidence and research that have shown they've worked. and really give them a fair chance, at interrupting these cycles of violence and helping to address the crisis. And so we've seen a lot of progress. The president has spoken about it multiple times. He's taken executive action to increase funding. He talked about it during the State of the Union. And so a lot of these behavioral focused strategies are being prioritized, but they are getting kind of gunked up in the political process, which I'm sure we'll talk more about.
Well, the political process and appropriations.
Yeah.
Like,
Yes.
where
Exactly.
are we funding the wrong things?
Right. Yeah.
Are we misdirecting? I mean, that's bad public policy.
Yeah.
If we think about public policy as a logical practice, I think that's a problem. It's not.
Yeah. And I mean, just to that point of appropriations, I think, again, we are, and I mean, you can see it in the research, right? Like, what the CDC invests dollars in is not necessarily the crises that are impacting the most lives. It's basically what has the most political muscle or the most media attention. And if you look at the research per death of gun violence versus things like tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS, it's kind of laughable, right? Like, we're throwing pennies at a really huge crisis. And I think that's a direct result of politics just being reactive to media or reactive to public pressure, but not actually taking a scientific approach to saving lives.
Right. Instead of being responsive.
Yeah.
Yeah. So from a criminal justice perspective, what do you most
I
want to
think
add here?
the main takeaway, and I agree with both David and Greg here, and actually I was thinking a lot about this as both of you were talking, is just this central fallacy that we have that crime problems have criminal justice solutions, or should have criminal justice solutions. And so when I'm most hopeful, I'm hopeful about public health solutions, or I'm hopeful, and I really appreciate you talking about some of the root causes. I'm a sociologist, as you know, in terms of my training and a background. What we used to call kind of social welfare sociological approaches, right? Addressing the roots of inequality and poverty. We've now rebranded that as public health in some senses because it's more palatable towards the public in general, because it isn't directly about helping the poor. It isn't directly about helping Black and brown communities, right? Which is where we don't have as much political support, right? So for me, we started by looking at that list of different policies that the RAND report covered. And of course, the issue with that report, and it's great they're working with the evidence that they have, is that that's based on research that's been done, right? And there's at least two factors, right, that constrain that, right? One is the incredible restrictions historically on research on guns, right, in the U.S. And two is, you have to have the policies implemented to look at it, right? This is an issue with kind of research in general, right? Is we need to have tried something in order to learn whether it works, right? And so there is an interesting model here that we have for reducing gun violence, and it's the rest of the globe. Literally the almost entire rest of the globe,
That's a lot
right?
of territory to cover.
Right, where we have, you talked about the discord between other crime rates and homicide and violent crime in particular. If you look at the relationship between assaults and murders and deaths, across countries in the world, we're this extreme outlier because when we fight, we die, right? Because there are guns involved. So for me, there's, all of these approaches are great, and again, the most promising approaches are public health approaches, actual folks on the ground doing things and working on a case-by-case basis. But you got to do something about the guns themselves, right? And that's where the politics get really tricky because of our particular history in the U.S., our particular culture of guns, and what guns mean, right? Because the politics of guns has nothing to do with this rational conversation about policies, right? It's about what guns mean in a symbolic sense to people in this country. That's where people's votes come from, or lack of votes come from, et cetera. So that's a less optimistic view of where we need to go from here. But I do think that you can't, we're working around the edges, right? And to make profound change, we also have to do something about the incredible number of guns and wide availability of guns in this country, and you can't get around that.
Can I show a slide just
Yes.
to emphasize Kevin's point?
I'm jealous now that I didn't bring slides.
So here's just the slide.
Old school.
So this just looks at a group where it's hard to blame the victim, and it's 5 to 14-year-olds. This is K through 8, and this compares the United States not to all the countries, but just to the high-income countries, because there are countries which don't have much police or are in civil war who do worse than we do. But the evidence is really true, is that compared to the other 30-plus high-income countries, we are an average country in terms of all different sorts of crime and violence. But where we are different is about guns. And this basically says that a child in the United States is more likely to die of a gun homicide than a child, say, in France or Japan or Canada or Germany or whatever. And it's not 50% higher or twice as high or 5 times as high. It's 26 times higher. 26 times higher. A child in the United States, a 13-year-old, 14-year-old, they get a failing grade, or their girlfriend dumps them. They go home, they find their dad's pistol, and they're 27 times more likely to die of a gun suicide. This notion that guns make us safer is just completely and utterly wrong. And so one of the things that the norms that need to get changed and the information that needs to get out is that the fact that a gun in your house is not a protective device, but it's really an incredible risk factor that someone in your home will die of a homicide, of a suicide, of an unintentional gun death. And the key thing to recognize, though, it doesn't mean that, we have guns, somebody's going to die. That just means that instead of having, say, 1.5% chance that sometime in the next 50 years someone will die, it becomes a 1.5% chance, which still is very, very low, but it means that who is you see in the morgue, particularly for suicides and unintentional firearm deaths, are people who live in households with guns.
And I think we've all been tricked. We've been tricked to think that a gun in the home makes you safer, and that's how you protect your family. And statistically, it doesn't hold true. It's not even the smartest approach to protecting your home. And so that's something that we're starting to talk a little bit more about. Is like, okay, obviously we want to keep our family safe, we want to keep ourselves safe. What is the safest way? And we always pivot back to the safest way to protect your home is a known deterrent. And a gun often is an unknown deterrent unless you have it sitting on the front door, there is a machine gun here. No, people don't do that. They have it in their closet, under their pillow, in their bed.
Where their kid can find it.
Right. But known deterrents are what deters people from breaking in your home, and that's leaving the light on, having a fence, having a dog that barks, having a sign that says there's a dog that barks, right? Letting whoever's trying to victimize you needs to know that you're not an easy target, and that quote unquote hardening of the schools that people say, we're not even talking about hardening our homes with these known deterrents that we know can reduce the likelihood of being victimized. But yet we've been tricked, I think, by the gun industry that this is a way to protect yourselves. And it's all marketing. I mean, I don't know why we have had such a hard time grasping that we're just the victim of a really, really aggressive marketing campaign, across over the years. I mean, since the 80s and 90s, when they couldn't sell any more hunting guns, they had to pivot to how do we get to women? How do we get to youth? How do we get to black folks? How do we get to suburban folks? How do we get to people who are wealthy? They had to pivot, and they did a impressive job at doing it, and we're all sitting here curious, why are we dealing with these stats? So anyway, just wanted to add that.
Yeah, although I'd say it's more the advertisement is incredibly effective when it taps into something that people already believe and want to believe. Fear, absolutely. And security is bad policy in this case, right? Hardening schools, right? Hardening your house, right? By buying a gun, right? Is bad policy. It's not effective, but it's good politics. And the reason that it's good politics is that it taps into a story that we've been telling ourselves about guns from the beginning of this country, right? Guns made us safer against, the British. But maybe even more significantly than that, right? We love our manifest destiny Western expansion, right, in this country. The idea of the homesteader, right, protecting his family, right? And I'm saying his here very intentionally, because masculinity is a big part of this, right? Is this incredibly important part of how we imagine America, right?
Yeah.
There's people out on the frontier with that. And of course, who are they protecting their family from? Bears, maybe for sure, but really, the people who already lived there, whose homes they were invading, right? Guns also have an important cultural part in our history as a way of controlling Black Americans, right? Going back to Birth of the Nation, right? In which, right, well, white people in blackface, right, are running around, and the heroes, right, are the white people with guns coming to restore order. It's a story that comes from slavery, the Fugitive Slave Act, right, right up through modern policing. And so that's always been there, and the gun industry found a way to bring it out, right?
Yeah.
And tap into it, and tap into fears of a changing America, right? Not a coincidence that Barack Obama getting elected, right? Gun sales go through the roof. Not a coincidence that every time that there's a large Black Lives Matter protest, gun sales, right, go through the roof. Gun sales increased as more women started working in and threatening kind of traditional male jobs, and men were kind of wondering what their place was in the world anymore. Well, they're the protector, right? The protector of their women, right? And so it's a way of reinforcing those old statuses, et cetera. So it has to tap into something, right? So I love to blame the gun industry. They have a huge amount of guilt and complacency in this, but they're tapping into something that is unique in the history of America that I think we have to acknowledge, right? Which is our, the history of this mix of misogyny and racism. That has, that guns have always played this important symbolic role in.
That's huge.
Well, you said it's good politics. I would argue it's toxic politics.
Oh, absolutely. Effective, I should have said, not good. You're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
And something I want to ask all of you is, we've talked about fear and tapping into this sort of mythology, the creation story or masculinity, whichever angle you want to take. But it also belies a mistrust in the people who are supposed to keep us safe, our neighbors, the police, politicians, government. I mean, all of those institutions. Like, isn't that what they're there for? So it has also fed mistrust at the community level, mistrust at the wider level, and it seems like it's a vicious cycle. Am I totally off base here?
Things have changed in some sense, which is that most people did not buy into this myth 40 years ago, right? I mean, it was like we still were in the same country. When I was young, there was 20 at one year. There was 26 primetime westerns being shown, and it was just guns, and more guns. And yet people did not have guns in their home for self-protection, right? And so something has changed, and now even as very slowly, that the data are showing over and over and over again that a gun in the home is a risk factor, it isn't safe, more and more people believe that a gun in the home is a protection. And the evidence is going the other way, and so you have to figure out how did this. It wasn't, maybe they tapped into the myth, but it wasn't just because the myth was not always.
Well, the myth has expressed itself in different ways over time, right? It's also driven support for the police and incarceration and criminal justice programs really literally since Reconstruction, right? But this is the current iteration of it, and it has been, and you do have to give the gun companies credit here, right? And politicians benefiting, right, from this issue for effectively making that link for people. This is the new thing. Take it into your own hands. It's up to you now to protect yourself, right, and your family. Right.
And that is the libertarian streak in the United States, which other countries don't have as much.
No.
Well, it's that, and it's ademocratic. I mean, organized societies exist, democracies exist in order to advance the public good. We can fight about what the public good means and who gets to decide what that is. But I think we can all agree there's just too much gun violence. And what do we do about those trust issues?
Yeah.
Right? What do we do to reduce the number of guns? What do we do to help ameliorate or reduce the root causes?
Well, certainly some states have done much better than other states, we know. I mean, it's this, and like a huge success story has been California, which was, there are lots of guns, lots of gun deaths, and then California changed in lots of ways. And one of the ways was simply that I think the Wellness Foundation gets a lot of credit. They put in $120 million to collect good data and good research, and it's paid money to advocates, and now California has at least as strong laws, if not stronger than Massachusetts. And their gun death rate has plummeted compared to the rest of the country. And they would, of course, do much better if Arizona was like them. And so, but it's certainly possible. It's not like this is a totally United States myth that everyone agrees on.
Yeah.
I also look at, just speaking of California, there are cities like Richmond, California, that looked at their crime data and looked at the homicide data, and they found that less than 2% of the population was connected to 80% of the violence. Okay. And so for them, it was like, okay, we have these strong laws, but what are we going to do about this 2%? How do we get to them? How do we help them? How do we figure out how to disrupt the cycle that they are entrenched in? And that's where programs like Advanced Peace were born, where they applied, cognitive behavioral therapy with those that are most at risk. They started pulling those individuals out of those environments, teaching them different things about life skills, conflict resolution, job training, and also providing real needed therapeutic care. And in that community, they saw a reduction of 50% in homicides, in I think 6 years. And so we're seeing that when we actually, specifically with homicide, when we pour into those who are most at risk, we can drastically see those reductions. Yeah. And California was definitely way ahead of the curve. Boston actually has a great history of applying these strategies too. And I think that when you come back to like, how can we fix this? I always ask myself, like, is America really trying to fix it? Yeah. Because there's all these like bright lights of how things have worked and succeeded. Yeah. And we've never really came together and said, okay, we're going to eradicate this once and for all. But we've done that with other health crises. Like we took HIV/AIDS head on. We took COVID-19 head on. We're taking the opioid crisis head on. And we've seen America rally around different health crises. But for this one, it seems like we don't want to fix it completely. We just want to get the mass shootings out the way. Or we want to stop the school shootings because, that's terrible. But, we don't, inner city stuff, we don't know, maybe, right? And I wonder what it's going to take to get over that hump where we have this aggressive, all-of-government, nationwide approach to eradicating it. Because I do believe the solutions are there, and we're seeing them work. We're seeing certain governors step up, certain mayors step up. We're seeing them hold the line or make reductions. But for some reason, it hasn't quite broken through.
What made the difference there?
In
the city itself, like who brought that approach? What was the game changer?
Well, I think it varies on city. I mean, in Boston, it was, I believe, faith leaders that led the charge, right? Faith leaders and survivors. But every community has different heroes. You have one here, Ruth Zuckerman, so give her a round of applause. But this is one of the big advocates in the state. Who's been fighting and putting pressure on the governor and different legislatures to bring forward some of these strategies. And so we're seeing heroes come in different forms. But I will say what I've noticed, typically it is survivors, right? It's people who are coming from those communities who finally get an audience and they say, hey, here's actually what we need. Not what the big institution prescribes, not what some politician in this place thought or what some academic research. No, like in our neighborhood, here are the things that we need. And in communities that have started to listen to people on either side of the gun, actually, but especially survivors, and started to implement those changes, I think they've been the most responsive. A good example right now is Baltimore, where you have a mayor who is a survivor who has seen a lot of these strategies work or struggle and has taken an all-of-government comprehensive approach, implementing evidence-based strategies, trauma-informed care. He trained every employee in the government trauma-informed care because they all interact with those who have been impacted. And while they haven't eradicated it yet, he's a young mayor, but they've held the line. And when you saw these spikes during COVID-19, it was one of the cities that plateaued, right? And so I think that's a big difference when we start listening to the people impacted and not just prescribing, right?
Yeah, that makes a whole bunch of sense, especially in democracy, right?
Yeah.
Listen to people, grassroots. So I think we have time for one more question here, and then we're going to get to audience questions, because it's something like 6:45. We want to give time for other people to talk. And I'm going to go back to the public health and trust problem. I mean, you said that we faced, as a society, these big problems head on, all of government approach. It took a long time, and there was a lot of skepticism. And I mean, the thing that most people in the audience are probably most familiar with is COVID. And public responses, good responses, bad responses, the mask wars, the vaccine mandates, the misunderstanding of how the best science to date is being communicated. So that is problematic in the issue of gun violence, especially since it's such a complicated issue. What about policing?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, from our perspective, I mean, we spent a lot of time in Congress and with the Biden administration, and the first step is just to break down this polarized view of guns in America that the NRA and the gun industry and even activists on the anti-gun violence side have pushed us in, that you have to go left or right. It's like, are you for guns or against them? Like that narrative, we have to deconstruct that because it is a public health crisis and it's way more complex. So if we can just start there, let's just step back for a second, that it's more than just that piece. And then we can start to lay out the public health approach where we look at, okay, well, what are the risk factors? What are the root causes? What's happening with suicide? What's happening with accidental deaths? What's happening with mass shootings? What's happening with school shootings? Because there's a strategy for all those different pieces. And while it may not be fun to talk about, it may not be like a cool commercial, it might not be something that's easy to tweet. But if we can get people to see the full table of solutions, then we can find politicians in any room that can support some of them. And I think that's what was beautiful about the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act is that it covered everything from suicide, youth violence, interpersonal violence, and even stretched towards some of the mass shooting reduction strategies. And while it didn't go extremely far in any one direction, it chipped away at a lot of those problems. And that's because I think they actually stepped back and looked at it comprehensively. And so I think that's the first big step is like, can we pull people out of the polarized debates and just get them to look at the comprehensive problem for what it is, and then think about all the solutions that exist and just figure out where can we start? Because right now we're getting stuck on like banning this weapon or this background check or this permit system, and we're stalling out, politically.
Yeah, well, if we lived in a perfect world, we would attack first the biggest problem. Like, what's causing the most death and destruction in terms of guns?
Yeah, I think, and a lot of, it's been really interesting to hear Greg talk in particular. And this is, again, the place that gives me hope, and so I hate being the pessimist on the stage as a result of it. But, thinking about HIV/AIDS, we actually did terrible on HIV/AIDS, right? As long as it was a gay disease, right? It was only once we successfully sold the public on the fact that everybody, right? And so, we have, there are a tremendous number of success stories, like some like Richmond and some of the other ones that you're talking about, where, and notably, right, that was not a criminal justice solution, right, to it. It was investing in those communities. And we have a long-standing a habit of wanting to blame problems of marginalized groups, and this includes gay people and HIV, Black and brown Americans, poor Americans, et cetera, as all the bad stuff that happens to them is their fault, and therefore not our responsibility to do anything about, right? Yeah. And so that's just this base barrier here of like, well, why don't we do these things we know work, right, in Black and brown communities? And why do we instead take criminal justice approaches that make the issue worse, right, and those communities? And those are the issues that we have to address, right? And I don't know that I've seen broad successes in any of these, but getting people to understand how these issues affect all of us, but also just, working on a culture of more empathy across all of these various groups, working on those base empathy deficits that we have in this country that are preventing us from supporting obviously common sense policies that have evidence, and so those are the discussions I think we need to. I think we are having, and there is some promising stuff that I can say at some point, but not everything is terrible in my view. But like those are the conversations that I think we need to have to push this forward.
I can talk a little about suicide, which even though it's by far the most people are dying from guns or dying in suicides. It's not the biggest gun problem because for the assaults, there's so many non-fatals and there's so much exposure to violence, which leads to the traumatization and so forth. But in just terms of deaths, it's suicide and gun suicide. And I think there the evidence is just overwhelming now that a gun in the home increases the risk of suicide for everybody in the home. And this is not a black and brown problem. This is not a gay problem. This is a white problem. And yet it's, we're just pushing and pushing. So one of the things like we've been working on is over the last 15 years now, I think every suicide expert understands the importance of guns in increasing the risk of suicide. And I think slowly but surely we're working with the medical community. But I think some of our most innovative work done by Kathy Barber in our group has been working with the gunners in trying to get them to understand what a serious problem this is and how they can do something to reduce the very, very serious suicide problem in their group. And so, for example, she went to Utah a number of years ago and talked with, and Utah is this very red state, which is basically the gun training capital of the United States. And she talked to the people there working on concealed carry laws. I mean, not concealed carry, they were training for concealed carry permits. And she said to them, oh, you're doing such a good job trying to reduce gun injuries. Maybe that's true. And she said, but do you realize that for every unintentional firearm death in Utah, there are 85 gun suicides? And they said, what? That can't be true. And she said, well, here's all these old white guys with guns. Raise your hand if you know someone who unintentionally killed themselves with a gun, and a couple of hands go up. Raise your hand if you know someone who committed suicide with a gun, and every hand goes up. And they said, well, geez, is that really true? What can we do? And she said, well, what if we worked on a module together to try to reduce gun suicide? Would you use that in your concealed carry classes? And they said, well, let's see. And she worked on it, and they loved it. They think this is the greatest thing because it's really about not the law changing, but social norms changing. And basically, it's the friends don't let friends drive drunk approach. And it's suicide comes in waves. And you can, if you can get through the bad period, you can survive. And it's, if your friend is going through a bad patch, he's getting a divorce and he's drinking and he's talking crazy, it should be your responsibility and everybody else should know it, including that person, that you should, and this is their phrase, babysit his gun for a while until things get better. And they love that. And they created this great PSA, which is, if you can look it up, it's this guy, he's at a firing range, and he's clearly a gunner, shooting, and then he stops and he turns toward the camera and he says, last year things were just going really bad for me. It's just everything was going terrible, and my friends, they babysat my gun for a while until things got better. And I think they saved my life. And then he goes back, and that's the end. It's just this big success story. And they were great because then they said, we really want to find out more about this and they got the state legislature in Utah to give money for a report, and they got all these people involved, and they gave the money to us, which was great, and they told everybody, you have to link data if Harvard asked for it. And for the first time ever, we have this linkage of data that has never been done before, which is you should be able to do in Massachusetts or any place, which is that here, anytime there was a suicide in Utah, we were able to link the data to all their medical records to see had they really seen people, how long ago did they see, is there anything the medical community could have done to help prevent this? The concealed carry people said, maybe it's true for some group, but the people who take our classes, they're not suicidal ever. And then we were able to link to, did they have a suicide, did they have a gun carrying license when they committed suicide? And a lot of them did. And so they said, maybe we could be doing something. And then this big report came out, and everybody who had been involved was right there. And so everybody said, all right, this is clearly true. This is an enormous problem. And the medical community said, we can do something. We can figure out what to do. And the gun community said, we can do something. And it was really this incredible public health approach that can have a real effect. And there is an example without any laws and it is just terrible that we have all, this polarization in the United States now, and that somehow guns have gotten into the culture wars, but that's the way it is. But it'd be nice if it wasn't, but there's still lots of things that can be done. And one of the things that, for the gun owners is how do so many people who everyone agrees shouldn't have guns get their guns? And one of the ways is that the gun owners who have passed the background check have the guns, and something like, we estimate 350,000 guns a year are stolen, and clearly a lot get into the wrong hands, and it's like they are feeding criminals, and it's like, come on, you can do better than that. And so many of the responsible gun owners said, yes, we should do better, but unfortunately then they vote for politicians who refuse to pass reasonable laws that would help reduce the gun theft.
I think I want to make sure we get to our audience questions. So, we have someone at the mic who is, you can introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Kayla Nordman, and I'm an undergraduate student at Suffolk University. And Kevin, my question is directed towards you. Since the success of public policy is so heavily influenced by public opinion, what do you believe can be done to change the narrative currently being peddled by the gun lobby that all gun control legislation is a violation of our Second Amendment rights?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a really difficult one, and there's also a complicated relationship between public opinion and policy where they don't always go perfectly together. But it's a question I spent a lot of time thinking about, as you might imagine. And the one thing that gives me, since I've been the pessimist the whole time, so I'm going to be the optimist for the moment. So the one positive thing for me is that attitudes have been changing, and they've particularly been changing among young folks, right? Folks who have grown up with school shootings, right? Even if school shootings are not the major issue, as we've discussed here, right? They've grown up with school shootings. They've grown up with school shooting drills, right? And they've also grown up in an era with Black Lives Matter, right? And so there's evidence, first of all, that there's substantial more skepticism about some of the stories we tell ourselves about guns among young folks. But there's also a greater understanding of things like systemic racism, misogyny, et cetera, in society, all of which is fueling a lot of energy for gun control movements, right? Or gun safety movements, right? Or public health that somehow gets something to do with our gun movements. So these things are not written in stone, that we have to live with them forever. They do involve these normative changes. And the normative changes historically have often happened within generations, right? As a generation that has had a different experience, right, than generations before them get together and say, we don't have to do it that way, right? We don't have to think the same way. We don't have to make these same mistakes. So when I'm looking for optimism, that's the optimism that I look for, because that's how change has happened in the past. And then those folks have parents and grandparents they can talk to. So that's the optimistic version of my answer. I have a pessimistic version, which is just really, really hard.
Can I say something too? Yeah. I also think a big part of it, to shift the narrative, is to get us out of the regulation and crime debates and pushing it more into like, this is a health crisis. What is a health approach? Because it's hard for them to wiggle back the Second Amendment over and over again if you're talking about a health crisis. So that's one thing that we're trying to do a lot of. I know a lot of activists here are doing the same thing, but pushing them into seeing how comprehensive the problem is so they can't just keep running with the same talking point.
Yeah. And the crime discussion historically is very loaded.
Yeah.
And so moving it away from that is, I think, a tremendous opportunity. So, yeah, I strongly agree with that.
And I would just say one thing, too, about public opinion, is that public opinion has always indicated that it wants all these common sense gun laws. Yeah. The overwhelming majority of people in the United States say, oh, yes, we want universal background checks, for example. We want this, we want this. We don't get any of those. Yeah.
That's still right now the case. Yeah. Universal background checks very.
Yeah. So it's not like just if you change public opinion, you sort of clearly, for certainly the laws, you need to do more than just change public opinion.
Absolutely.
All right.
Hello, my name is Jen Glickman, and I'm a master's student in Suffolk University's Crime and Justice Studies program. So I'm sorry, my question is going to be kind of on the criminal side again a bit, which I do think is a big part of the conversation still, even if we don't want it to be. But my question is for Greg, thinking about the important work that community justice does. I sometimes find that conversations around getting harsh on guns and banning and restricting guns can really miss a bit of the nuance that the communities that are most affected by gun violence are also the communities that are affected by very racist carceral policies. Yep. So when thinking about gun policies, how can we ensure that these policies and the enforcement of these gun policies don't end up just perpetuating cycles of mass incarceration?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, because again, if we really accept that this is a public health crisis, we can't just take a crime control response, and that's what happened with the crack epidemic. Yep. We took a crime control approach to a public health crisis, and really destroyed damn near the whole black community, right? Yep. And honestly, I think a lot of the violence we're seeing now, especially when people, oh man, I get so worked up when people say fatherlessness. It's like, well, that's because of what happened then. And so a lot of the ripples from that epidemic is what's creating the crisis that we're seeing now. And so I think like the way to, I don't know if there's a perfect way to avoid it, but I think the first big thing is just to acknowledge that crime control strategies is the reactive component to reducing gun violence. It should be focused on homicide closure rates, which are terrible, by the way. In most communities, it's less than 50%. Imagine living in a reality where half the people who commit a homicide are not even getting caught, and then telling them, don't get a gun. It's like, whoa, what do you mean? Like, y'all aren't affected. And we're also in a world where the upstream accountability structures have been completely defunded. Like, ATF is almost a joke right now because of the lack of resources they have. They do not have enough inspectors or any type of infrastructure to even hold gun dealers or manufacturers accountable. So from our perspective, we really think the first step is accepting it as a public health, knowing that the crime control strategies to supplement the health-based and community-based strategies, and then making sure that the accountability is not just on the individual who's scared for their life, but really thinking about who created those conditions and really looking upstream to holding manufacturers accountable, gun dealers accountable, traffickers accountable, and then looking at the communities that have been victimized and figuring out how do we address it. That would be my recommendation.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, my name is Skylar. I first want to say I appreciate all three of you guys for coming here and talking on such an important issue. My question is directed towards David due to his public health policy background. So it's been mentioned multiple times throughout the panel that suicides account for a majority of gun violence deaths. But as we see in news coverage, it is like virtually not talked about whatsoever. And so why do you think coverage on America's suicide statistics and the public health crisis it presents isn't being talked about in the news media? And how has that influenced the national conversation on gun violence?
I guess it's not in the news because it's not. A lot of people, for a lot of people, it's shameful, so they don't want to talk about it. It's the police aren't called, and the reporters are going with the police. They're not going with the medical examiners, I think it would make a big difference. I just don't know how big a difference it would make, but it certainly would change the narrative somewhat. I mean, the gun lobby really wants to say over and over again that if someone wants to commit suicide, they will. It doesn't matter whether the gun is there, even though the evidence is just overwhelming that the availability of lethal means makes it determines whether or not people live or die. And it's the same way in interpersonal violence. The availability of lethal means determines. It's not like it's not like these other developed countries don't have big problems in terms of racism and gangs and poverty and all these other things, but it's the gun that makes the lethal.
And there's been guidance too, like the media industry has guidance about how they report about suicide with the belief, and I'm not an expert enough to have an opinion on it, but the belief is that we don't want to report about incidents because we don't want to inspire more incidents. But it's funny how that's how they deal with suicide.
Right.
But when it comes to homicide, it's tell them more and more and more, give it to them.
Mass shootings.
Yeah,
Mass
shootings,
right.
Copycats.
And this is, I actually think this is part of what's fueling a lot of youth violence too, is because we're being overexposed or just inundated with stories of violence and death, and it's normalizing what we see as okay, not just what we click and what we like, but also when we're in a conflict, how we move, and how we operate and what decisions we make. And so there are real standards in media around how to talk about suicide. Yeah. Those standards don't exist with other forms of gun violence, and that's a big problem.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Been online, so we had around 167 people connected, and I'll try to just connect them together. So we had one of the questions that came out from different people. I have Alan, David, Matthew, Patricia. Many of them have asked about the role of media in like gun violence reduction, and if there is any safeguards. That is one of the questions that came up. The other questions was about how could we work together, putting aside polarization and work together regardless of if we're Congress, the White House, executive branch, or at the local level to fight this. And what is the role of early education? That was the third point into raising the awareness among children and teenagers for a better future and gun reduction. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about working together a little bit again in the suicide area. There's been some successes about working, public health working with the gun community about suicide and particularly working with gun shops. It really started out in New Hampshire where the public health community discovered that in 1 week, 3 people had gone to this one small gun shop and bought guns and killed themselves. And the gun shop owner was devastated. He didn't want that to happen. They worked together and tried to figure out ways. What could gun shops do to help reduce suicide? And it's not like they could solve the problem, but they can certainly make it so it's less likely for the 5 to 10% of people who just didn't have a gun, go buy one, and then kill themselves, to make it less likely that the gun shop will sell them a gun. If a woman comes in and says, I want to buy a gun, and you say, okay, what kind do you want? And she says, I don't care. And you say, okay, how about this? Do you want this? And she says, oh, that's fine. You say, now how many bullets do you want? And she says, well, 1 will be enough. And you don't have to sell her a gun, and you can figure out ways to get her help and probably save her life rather than make that sale. And that's just a sort of a simple example of people working together and not caring about whether you're red or blue or whatever.
So I'll say something briefly about the media aspect of it. And it gets to some of the crack and opioid epidemic as well, which is we have a real problem in journalism. He says in a building full of journalists.
That's easy to hear it.
We have a real problem with sources, right? And I think journalism schools are aware of this and discuss it regularly, right? But the sources for crime stories, for gun stories, for drug stories are cops and prosecutors, right? And in fact, not cops and prosecutors, they're PR departments, because cops and prosecutors aren't dumb. They hired media people, right, in order to talk to the journalists. So cops have a huge amount of control over the stories we tell about crime, about shootings, about drugs, right? And the solutions that they propose are shocking. It's to give more cops resources, more resources to the police. And so this is warped how, and you see this everywhere. I mean, this is in the New York Times, right? If you read coverage of crime, this is not like dumping on any a particular form of journalism. This is an endemic issue in journalism. And first of all, police should be on the front lines of gun control, right? Their lives are at risk on a regular basis, and some notably are, and have worked as partners. But many aren't, and police have used guns as a reason to increase their own arsenals very substantially over time, used to lethal end. And also to justify the shoot first mentality, right, that we hear about a lot in a lot of the killings of civilians, right? Well, I have to assume every situation, everyone has a gun in it, so I can't pause to see if that kid is holding, a toy to it. So if you read media coverage of gun stories, of murders in particular, right, if we're getting beyond, right, the mass shootings and whatnot, right, the stories that they tell have blame someone, and that blame is you haven't given us enough resources to come in on the criminal justice side and stop these guns, and that's the only thing. What we need to hear is the successes of programs, right, like yours, right, public health approaches, right? Those need to be the stories that are told. They need to be talking to both of you, right, before that, right? And so that's the kind of safeguard. And again, lots of I know, journalism programs are really thinking critically about this in the recent past, but that's a huge safeguard that we need, is it matters who journalists talk to because they get to frame the story. And if we want to shift the narrative and have a public health approach, then the newspaper stories need to tell that story, right? That's who they need to blame for the problem, right? They need to frame it in a public health way and propose those kinds of solutions.
And I think a lot of the reason why politicians don't work together is because of the media's perspective. And I didn't quite believe it. I was like, oh, a lot of Republicans don't want to touch this issue. But when the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was passed, I was sitting in the hall and I watched Republicans in tears, high-fiving each other, happy that they were able to finally do something after Buffalo, after Uvalde, after Highland Park. And I was like, wow, we just got to give them an excuse. And we know the public opinion is there. As he shared earlier, the stats are there. The surveys show where we stand. What's wrong or what's twisted is this kind of warped public perspective. And it is right in your face. So our team, we went to Buffalo. I was in Buffalo 3 days after that mass shooting. And I'll never forget, you couldn't even get to the scene 3 blocks. You couldn't even get 3 blocks away from the scene without police stopping you, yellow tape, no, you're not, who are you? So I had to tell them, oh, I'm working with this organization. I'm helping survivors. We're a community-based organization. Finally let us through. You get there and there's an entire media parking lot where there are hundreds of cameras who have access that are holding cameras that are telling the stories of pain, trauma, but yet community organizations that are trying to help are getting stopped by law enforcement and have to walk 3 blocks to get there. It's this trauma-tainment mentality where we want to show the blood, the gore, the pain, and the community groups that we're trying to help couldn't even get support. I remember there was 2 elderly gentlemen who were canning out food. They were over 60 years old. I'm like, man, let me help you, move some potatoes. And all these camera people start taking pictures of us. And I'm like, put the camera down and help us. Like, no, we're not allowed. We're working right now. And I'm like, okay, so you obviously care about this story more than these traumatized individuals. And this, and at every turn, we're seeing the media look at this bleeds, it leads thing and chasing likes and clips and hits. And they're creating a narrative that is warping the entire crisis that's getting in the way of politicians making good decisions, and it's getting in the way of our public perspective about what should be done, what could be done, what the problems are, who the bad guy is, right? Where they're painting a picture based on what they think is attractive versus the reality of what's happening. And it's creating this kind of echo chamber that's is especially impacting our youth, right, who don't have a life of context to build off of and make their own decisions from. So I think it's a huge challenge, and it's something that we're starting to study. We have a study where we're looking at what happens when a shooting happens in the inner city versus in the suburbs. In the inner city, everything is about the incident and the crime, nothing about the person, nothing about the issue. In the suburbs, let's discuss the issue. Let's have a story on how to address gun violence. Let's talk about the person, what happened, why, how'd they get here? Oh, was it a mental health breakdown? What middle school they go to? What their parents do, right? And it's a very different story, and the media is really biased, frankly, in how they're doing this, and no one's holding them accountable. So I think it's a huge part of the problem that we have to figure out how to shift the narrative, or at least make it more equitable, because it's going to keep driving us further and further away from where we want to land.
And what the media does too is just the focus on the violence over and over and over, so that you look at the polls, and every year they ask, do you think crime and violence has increased in your neighborhood or not? And everybody always says yes, no matter which goes up, it goes down, whatever. There's always this feeling that crime and violence are increasing, and there's nothing to do with reality.
So this is really rich conversation, which is different than what a lot of sound bites are doing. But we do have a lot of audience questions. So I'm going to suggest a lightning round, and that you guys can keep your answers kind of short.
Like,
so maybe we can take. No. Maybe we can take like 3 quick questions, and you guys go at it.
Hi, I'm here on behalf of Moms Demand Action, but the question that I'm asking on behalf of myself. I'm just going to read it, and I'm trying to read it fast since it's kind of a quick, long-winded, but quick. Massachusetts has an active red flag law that allows someone who has access to a gun to have that gun temporarily removed if they are determined to be unsafe to themselves or the public. So Donna's law is trying to get passed federally and has already been passed in a few states. This law will allow individuals who suffer from depression disorders to put themselves on a do not purchase list. This will allow them not to have the ability to obtain a gun when they're in a manic episode, when they're suffering a suicidal ideation. As you're aware, suicide is the leading cause of death. With a firearm, you are more successful when you are attempting to commit suicide. Do you, as this panel, believe that Donna's law, if passed, would play a major role in saving lives as well as not infringing on anyone's Second Amendment right, since it's oneself that is preventing themselves from accessing a gun?
Okay, so red flag laws, can we have another question? We're going to do lightning round.
It's not a red flag, it's Donna's law.
Hello, I'm Talia Rivera. I'm the executive director of the Fund for a Safer Future, which is the largest national funders collaborative that's focused on reducing the toll of gun violence in America. And so last year, we invested $2 million in research projects, and we are expected to also make some investments in research this year as well. And I guess my question is to any of you, but really, David, I would love to hear your perspective, but where do you feel like the real gaps in research are, and where should we be putting our money?
All right, one more, and then you guys can have at it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ruth Zachrin, and I am the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. And first, I just want to appreciate my friend Greg, not just for your kind words, but for all of the support that CJAF has shown to the coalition. A lot of the good things we've been able to do here in Massachusetts around increased funding for community-based solutions has been done with the support and love of CJAF, so thank you. My question is, prior to coming to this work, I spent over 25 years working with survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And we know there's a huge intersection between domestic violence and gun violence, everything from DV homicides perpetrated with a gun, the trauma cycles because we have young people witnessing violence in their homes, the number of people who perpetrate mass shootings who have a history of violence against women. There's so many layers to it. Yet we're not really talking so much about that intersection between domestic violence and gun violence. It's something that I very much want to elevate in the conversation. I'd love to hear thoughts about what we can do to have a much more robust national conversation about how all of those things intersect. So thank you.
All right, so Donna's Law, where we should be putting research money, and the intersection between all of these things, particularly with domestic violence.
I think Donna's Law is a good law. It's not going to make a major difference, but it'll make some difference, and it's very low cost, and why not? Shouldn't we? Of course, we have it. Fund for a Safer Future, it's really nice that we've gotten some of that money. It's really, really good. I would argue that for 25 years, there's been so little gun research that it's sort of like asking a cancer researcher, what are the two things we need to know that, it's like, no, we know nothing. I mean, we know so little, there's so much stuff we need to know. As far as I know, for example, there hasn't only been, I don't know if there's been any really peer-reviewed empirical article about open carry. But you name it, there's almost no good research about gun theft, and on and on. So we just need a lot more, and things are getting much better, but it's still, we've just touching the surface. And then, yes, there's a clear intersection between, and that's women and women's violence and gun violence, and that should be one of the many things that. And more researchers are in the field now, and they will hopefully be looking at it.
Yeah, yes. Agreed.
All right, easy, moving on.
I think just specifically with domestic violence, though, a big gap that we see is that there's still, the solutions we keep seeing over and over again are still very incarceral and punitive, or when should the abuser have access versus the victim have access. And I still think we're gliding over resources for people and behavioral strategies to help address and reduce the likelihood of domestic violence, or helping people navigate out of those abusive situations. And so I just think there's just so much more work to be done there, especially in communities where there isn't that trust in law enforcement. So those incarceral strategies are never going to really work, especially in Black communities. And so obviously we're already partners on a lot, but I think that's a huge opportunity to grow.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. Well, first of all, yes, agreed with everything David said. Answered most of it. But I'll add on that once again, this comes down to an issue of kind of conflict and power, and we've traditionally allowed what happens in the home to happen in the home, from a misogynistic perspective, right? Husbands, it's their realm, they can do what they want, right? So that's been our historical approach to domestic violence, has been actually to not police it for the most part, except when the people are in marginal communities, and then we over-police it. But so even things like red flag laws, which are great, are wildly underused at the moment. They're not actually being employed, and so there's an issue of education that always comes with these kind of changes, and that we need to educate everyone involved in this process about what the options are, what their rights are. We need to educate the people enforcing it as well.
All right, I know there are more questions, but we are running overtime, as a matter of fact. So would you be willing to answer questions over email? We can collect them.
Sure.
And
Of course, yeah.
So hopefully that will help with the lack of time to ask all of these questions. I get moderators, professors' privilege of asking a last quick question, which comes from my summary of what I've learned tonight. It's complicated. We don't know anywhere near enough of it about the issue, and we need to change the narrative. So given that, what do you think is the single most, and I hate this question, like when somebody asks me, but I'm going to do it anyway, the single most impactful thing you could do if you had the resources?
I'll just talk for myself because I'm a researcher. I'm an economist by training, and I believe in specialization in the division of labor. And I'm pretty good at research. So if I had a lot more money and better data, I could do much more research. And I think research, as I mentioned, in all the success stories that I wrote about, research really mattered. And so that's what I would do.
I would say invest in the communities most impacted by violence and investing in programs that we know work, strengthening those, strengthening our education system, strengthening our housing system, and recognizing it's not taking money away from anything because the average homicide costs a city government $2 million. So we're already paying it. Like everybody that drops is $2 million lost. So imagine if you took, I don't know, 400,000 of that per person that could have passed, right? No. And invested in those communities, you would have a totally different reality for those young men and women in those communities. And so I think as opposed to just paying for death that we're doing every day, our taxpaying dollars are paying for it, we should invest in life and invest in those communities and in strategies that work. That's what I would do.
Yeah. That very definitely is switching the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And so from a personal standpoint, I would like more money from research. My real answer is exactly what Greg said, which is from a sociological background, I mean, you have to invest in alternative strategies and resources for communities and fix those problems. So I'll give a different answer instead, though, which is a lot of folks here I know are involved in social movements for gun action. That is how we change culture, right? Is organization, is action, is getting involved in those movements, right? Social movements have changed narratives throughout our history about important issues, and so that's incredibly important work, and we need to invest there as well.
Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts. Thank you for all of your wonderful questions and your attention, both in the room and online. Good night.